speaker comes from a company that's been founded back in 1843. Obviously, he was not part of that company back then, but he is a legend. And he is the current president of the Economist group. So please give a warm welcome to Paul Rossi here on the stage. And we need a clicker for Paul here. Paul, thank you. Thank you for joining us.
I've never been called a legend, so thank you.
Well, I do it twice today for you.
Yeah, that's very good.
Once at the press conference and once here. We would need a clicker, please, here at the stage so Paul could start his presentation. But before you start, we were talking that people are kind of rebelling against what they see. You promised me a very controversial speech here on that stage. I hope it will be like this. And dear all in the room, please start asking your questions right now from the app, which we will be showcasing later on the stage. And I would love to ask your questions personally to Paul here. Okay, so where is the clicker now so we can start? Thank you very much. Here you are, Paul.
Thank you. That's, how do I go backwards? Okay. So, it's a bit controversial to be at a digital conference. Thank you for turning up after lunch. I know that this is probably the graveyard shift because you've all had chocolate at lunchtime or something. So, I'll try and make it entertaining. So, I think it's a little bit controversial at a digital conference to talk about the challenge of digital advertising. And I think the big issue is that a lot of tech companies are talking about disruption and how technology is disrupting the industry. But I would argue that actually we're not talking about disruption, we're talking about consumer rebellion. So all of the data in the world, all of the ad tech in the world is not going to change the fact that consumers actually don't like your ads. And we'll talk our way through that as I go through the presentation. So there's a really interesting thing that's happening with all of the technology and all of the phones and mobile and social and video and all the things you've been talking about. But actually what you're now seeing, I think, is that there is a rebellion against choice. Consumers have so many ways to consume news, so many ways to be entertained, and that actually what they're doing is effectively clustering around a few products or, more importantly, brands that they value. And I would argue that in many cases, traditional brands have a very strong place to play in this, despite what you may have heard from people earlier. So if you look at what's happening with television, most people on average have access in an average month to nearly 200 channels. The reality is they're spending 100% of their time on less than 20. That's a cluster. That is, people are starting to move in an ecosystem that they want, that they've chosen. Similar with apps. Everyone has apps on their phone. On average, we have 27 apps, but we're spending nearly 80% of our time on just 5. Again, if you're a media company, you need to be one of the 5, not one of the 27. And similarly, when you look at websites, the numbers are broadly the same. In an average month, people are accessing 100 websites. The reality is they're spending 50%, half of their time on just 5. So this choice that we've all got, I think people are rebelling against. That actually, if you want to be in this game, you've got to be valuable and relevant to the consumer. And that's not a technology issue in many cases. But I think this other point that's interesting is that I think consumers are rebelling against advertising. And why do I say that? We've had sessions on ad blockers earlier this morning. The ad blocking number, any ad blocking number that you hear is immediately out of date because they're being installed at a rate that no one can really keep up with. And why are people doing it? Because it's good. Let's not deny the fact, and we can talk about the perceived moral imperative for consumers to support media. They don't care. They don't have any moral obligation to support media. Ad blockers are good because they work. This is a thing that was in the New York Times recently. They looked at 50 websites and they looked at the data that was going through a mobile phone to look at a page. It is 4 times, and this is the Boston.com. You probably can't quite see it up there, but without an ad blocker, the page takes 33 seconds to load. With an ad blocker, 7. Why is a consumer going to use an ad blocker? Because it's just better. It's a better internet experience. We can have a long debate about whether advertisers have ruined the internet or marketers have ruined the internet, but the reality is consumers are voting with their feet on this, and if you have any doubts about the scale of it, there are currently over 200 million people around the world on the internet with an ad blocker installed. That's 3 times the population of Turkey. And if you worry that that's not a big enough thing to get worried about, or if you're not worried about the size of it, worry about the money. This is just the US, $20 billion of inventory blocked. 20 billion and rising. This number is rising by the day. If you look at segments of the consumers, I'm probably the oldest one in the room here. I'm the last person to put an ad blocker on my browser, but if I was a millennial, half of the millennials, depending on whatever study you look at, are using ad blockers every day. Half. So this number is huge, and if you should worry about any number, it's the fact that that money is not money going into your bank account. And I always think that it's interesting to look at the data around the people who are buying the ads. So this is a fantastic statistic. 41% of agency executives and 45% of marketers have an ad blocker installed on their computer at work today. So even they don't believe that advertising is something they want to see. And they're the people buying it. So I think we have a fundamental challenge for advertising because consumers have moved to block it. Consumers have moved to say, I don't want this stuff. It's not additive to my experience. And marketers always follow consumers, and I would argue that marketers are rebelling against this as well. What does that mean? This is a fantastic quote because it's true. And this is Brad Jaitman, who's the president of Pepsi Bottling. And basically, he doesn't like pre-roll advertising on video because, as he says, the contract with the consumer is, watch this crappy ad for 10 seconds before you get to the content you want. What kind of relationship is that with customers? How is that additive to a customer experience? And the skip this button, is probably the most used button on the internet when it comes to video because people don't want to watch your ads. So marketers are starting to rebel against this. The other thing that marketers are starting to rebel against is just the data. So we've talked earlier, people have been talking about the data that you capture, but if you look at this phenomenal rise, and this is Rob Norman from Group M, phenomenal rise in video viewing online, Snapchat 4 billion, Facebook are over 4 billion, Google are over 8 billion, whatever the numbers are. Huge growth in video, but every single platform measures what a video view is differently. 2 seconds, user-initiated, not initiated. So there is a slight rebellion coming from the marketers, from the agencies, about what is the number that we're really looking at. And this is only getting worse as you look at the clustering and the money that's going into these big platforms. Today, in the UK, half of all digital ad spend goes to 2 people, Facebook and Google, half. So as these platforms, and Apple is now moving into that space, as these platforms start to take more and more money, there's going to be a higher demand, in my view, to have consistent data and a consistent way of measuring it, because marketers are getting fed up with the fact that everybody counts something in a different way. And if you think about that in the legacy terms of the print industry, if we all counted circulation differently for magazines, people would rebel as well. And this seems to me to be the same problem. And I think there's this other disruption going on, as we've talked earlier about content marketing, the role of content, that I think there's a slight rebellion against the big advertising holding companies. And I think what clients are doing, feeling the need to pull the really important stuff closer to themselves. So the stuff that they really value isn't media buying anymore, because a machine can do that, as you saw earlier. What they really want to pull closer to themselves and be much more engaged with is the creative and the way that they're positioning their companies. So I think you will see in the coming 18 months, 2 years, a much bigger swing of things going in-house amongst clients, and that will leave money That'll take money away from advertising agencies unless you can be a really compelling content and creative partner. The value in media buying is disappearing slowly and slowly, and if it's not disappearing, it's going in-house. And this is the other thing, which I think is one of those unspoken things about digital advertising. By some estimates, 30% of all online ad spend is fraud. And what does that mean? I was talking to a very senior marketer at P&G, and she said, I know that about 30% of my online ad buy through networks or programmatic or whatever it is actually fraud, but I can't tell my boss because I am embarrassed by the fact that I don't know where the money's going. So the old line used to be 50% of my marketing was wasted, I just didn't know which 50%. Now it's 30% is being stolen. We did a special report at The Economist last year, and we interviewed a hacker in San Francisco who had spent the last 3 or 4 years doing credit card fraud. And he'd given that up, and he said to our journalists, I gave it up because it's actually quite difficult, and it's quite dangerous because people come after you. You know, people want to arrest you if you do credit card fraud. So he's now converted everything to ad fraud because there's more money, it's easier, and no one comes after you. That's a fact. This is a real number that no one's talking about. Why is no one talking about it? Because there's a huge vested interest in no one knowing this number. Why is all this important? Because the CMO is on the rise in organizations. This is McDonald's, the new CMO of McDonald's, CEO, of McDonald's was the former CMO, brand officer. You will see, I think, in the next 2 years, the rise of the CMO. Data is on their side. They want to know where the money's going. But my view is that more and more companies are going to be led by marketers because more and more companies have to be marketing companies in this day and age to break through. So what does all this mean? A couple of sort of predictions for you. What we're seeing absolutely happening in the US, that rebellion against all those channels and all that choice, the rebellion in the US is against the cable box companies. So the cable box companies are in real trouble. Consumers are cutting the cable, and they're cutting the cable in really quite big numbers and growing. So 1 in 10 US households have got rid of that cable box. They are now watching all of their television, all of their video over the top. They're watching it through Netflix or Amazon Prime. These numbers, which you can't really see, I don't think, but if you look at that amongst millennials, those dreaded millennials, it's even higher. So guess what? There's no ads in Netflix. And guess where Netflix is coming? It's coming here, it's coming everywhere outside of the US. If you look at the growth in subscription revenues for Netflix over the last year, the real growth is coming from international. They're doing that country by country, but if you look at Hulu, you look at Amazon Prime, you look at all of these people, this is the changing landscape of video, and guess what? There's no ads in 90% of what people are now consuming. So that rebellion may not be conscious against advertising when it comes to TV, but it's definitely happening. And I would also predict that when you look at these fundamental forces that are at play, ad technology, fraud, ad blocking, all of that sort of stuff, that if you are a pure play ad business, you're going to be in trouble next year. And you're going to be in trouble because marketers will be spending less with you. The free money that a lot of ad tech has had access to grow will start to dry up. So my prediction is you will see some significant merging or closing of pure play ad businesses, right? Businesses that are depending on online advertising. They will start to consolidate, and I think you'll actually see some go out of business. And if you don't believe me, even YouTube now has a second revenue stream. They have now launched a premium ad-free service, $9.99 for YouTube Red, and this is a killer, right? Amazon have just opened their first bookshop because it cannot fundamentally compete with what is called clicks and mortar, with the department stores, with people who have retail outlets. They have to start thinking about retail. So this world is changing. A lot of talk about collecting data. I think one of the challenges with data is that it's very hard to be predictive and very hard to be accurately predictive. So whilst you might know everything about me, you don't really know what I'm going to do next. And I think that's one of the challenges. People assume the data is going to tell people what they're going to do next, or tell marketers what people are going to do next, and I don't think that's true. This is a really interesting stat. If you look at a graph of the CPM of Google Advertising over the last 18 months, it is a continuous drop. So the CPMs that Google are able to get from their advertising have been on a continuous decline for a year. This is the Facebook number. Their inventory is declining, but their rates are going up because they have first-party data. And that's the real killer thing. You've got to have the first-party data. The other prediction over the next year will be that you will see more and more people focusing on trying to capture people's attention and sell advertising against attention. Click-throughs, CPMs are a thing of the past, in my opinion. You will start to see companies saying, I got an hour, I'm going to give you an hour of our consumers' time, 2 hours of our consumers' time. The vast majority of web pages are not viewed by a human. We have an initiative at The Economist where we're starting to sell advertising based on time. And to qualify for that, for an ad to even be considered, it has to be on a page where there has been a mouse interaction in the last 5 seconds. The ad has to have been viewable for between 5 seconds and 30 seconds. That's the minimum starting point. If you apply that criteria to many, many, many websites, they have no inventory because the people viewing the pages are actually robots, and they don't rebel against advertising. The last thing, I think, is this rise in native advertising. We talked about it earlier. Let's be clear, native advertising is trying to convince a consumer that it's not an ad. So it's not without its problems in terms of the long term, but there is a huge rise in native advertising, and in the UK, this growth rate is actually really quite significant, 50% in the last 18 months. So I think I'm optimistic about the future in the sense that I think marketers still need to do advertising. I think they will spend their money with brands that they trust, brands that have a relationship with their audience. You can't block a print ad in a magazine or a newspaper. Rarely does a consumer tear out an ad from a magazine and throw it in the bin. They tear it out and they take it to the shop and buy the product occasionally, but they're not rebelling against that. They're not rebelling against outdoor advertising. They're not rebelling against advertising around a stadium. So there are forms of advertising that I think will absolutely thrive. But I think the world of digital is really quite challenging, and there are lots of things to worry about next year. Thank you.
Do you hear me? You promised a controversy, but actually what you did is you built a new image of the industry, particularly advertising. I'm sure that there are a lot of people from the advertising industry, especially upstairs at the advertising lounge.
Which is why we're down here.
Maybe that's why we have them there upstairs, otherwise it will be quite a conflict here. But there were a couple of questions. First one is about the native advertising. And what do you think, how do you think it's going to go? You just mentioned, do you see it as a kind of a conflict with the media neutrality there?
I think the conflict only happens if a consumer...
This question is from Doga Oziu directly.
I'm glad you didn't ask me to pronounce that, but yes.
I hope that I did right.
I think the conflict is simple when you think about the consumer. So if a consumer it turns out to be native advertising, then I think there is a huge problem. The challenge with native advertising is that's what marketers want, right? Marketers in an ideal world want a media brand to write about their products and services in a positive way, and it looks like it's a third party. It looks like it's the brand talking. That is a real challenge because, you know, native advertising is designed to put some smoke and mirrors around that. So I think there is a challenge if brands, media companies are not clear and explicit about the source of the content, and that's where the trouble starts.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot, Paul. It was